The detention cell aboard the Zephyrian flagship Eternal Dominion hummed with the low vibration of exotic matter engines. Commander Sarah Chen sat cross-legged on the cold metal floor, her wrists bound by energy shackles that pulsed with an eerie blue light. Blood trickled from a cut above her left eyebrow, a souvenir from her capture 3 hours ago when her reconnaissance shuttle had been overwhelmed by enemy fighters. The cell door materialized from solid wall to transparent barrier as advanced technology shifted its molecular structure. Through it stepped creatures that would have terrified most humans. The Zephyrians stood nearly 8 feet tall, their elongated limbs moving with predatory grace. Their skin resembled polished obsidian, marked with intricate silver patterns that seemed to shift in the light. Most unsettling were their eyes, large, multifaceted like those of insects, but burning with an intelligence that spoke of a civilization millions of years older than humanity. Behind the guards came their queen. Even among her own species, she was magnificent and terrible. Queen Vexithera stood 9 feet tall, her crown a living organism that pulsed with bioluminescent veins. Her presence filled the small cell with an almost tangible aura of power and ancient authority. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that seemed to resonate in Sarah's bones. Human soldier. The Queen's words were perfectly articulated despite the alien vocal cords that produced them. You intrigue me. When we captured your vessel, you fought with a ferocity that impressed even my most seasoned warriors. Yet when faced with certain death, you surrendered to protect your wounded crew. Such contradictions fascinate me. Sarah remained silent, meeting the Queen's alien gaze without flinching. She had been trained for this moment, drilled in resistance protocols and psychological warfare, but nothing could have prepared her for the sheer presence of this being, who commanded an empire spanning 3 galaxies. The Queen continued, her head tilting in a gesture that was almost bird-like. We have been monitoring your species for some time now. Humans are curious creatures. You appeared in our galaxy merely 2 centuries ago, yet you have spread with remarkable tenacity. Most species we encounter either submit immediately or fight themselves into extinction within a generation. You do neither. We're harder to kill than we look, Sarah said finally, her voice hoarse but steady. A sound like crystalline chimes emerged from the Queen's throat, what passed for laughter among her kind. Indeed, we have conquered 17 different civilizations in the past millennium. The Korthak, with their living ships and plasma weapons, fell in 6 months. The ethereal collective, masters of space and time manipulation, lasted 2 years. Yet your primitive species has held us at bay for 50 years with ships that are little more than metal shells propelled by chemical reactions. Sarah's jaw tightened. It was true that human technology lagged far behind their enemies. Where the Zephyrians wielded weapons that could unmake matter at the quantum level, humans still relied on kinetic projectiles and nuclear warheads. Where alien ships could fold space itself, human vessels crawled between stars at a fraction of light speed. The war should have been over before it began. You want to know why? Sarah said, reading the alien's expression as well as she could. I want to understand, the Queen replied, moving closer to the energy barrier. My scientists study your tactics, your technology, your biology. They find nothing remarkable. Your soldiers die as easily as any other species when shot. Your ships explode when hit by our weapons. Your colonies burn just like all the others. Yet somehow, impossibly, you endure. The Queen's guards shifted restlessly, their compound eyes never leaving Sarah. She could sense their nervousness. Even these elite warriors, who had participated in the conquest of worlds, seemed uneasy in their Queen's presence during an interrogation. Perhaps, the Queen continued, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than her earlier words, it is time we took a more direct approach to understanding your species. My interrogation specialists have techniques that can extract every memory, every secret, every fear from your primitive brain. When they are finished, you will tell me everything about human military strategy, colony locations, and defensive capabilities. Sarah smiled for the first time since her capture, an expression that didn't reach her eyes. You're welcome to try. Others have. Oh, I know about the others, the Queen said, her patterns shifting color slightly. The Valdoran mind flayers who claim no human psyche could resist their mental intrusions. 3 of them went insane trying to break a single human soldier, the Nexus Collective with their neural disruptors that can shatter any consciousness in the galaxy. Somehow your people developed a resistance we still don't understand. The truth was classified beyond Sarah's clearance level, but she had heard rumors. Stories of volunteer soldiers who underwent horrific experimental procedures to develop mental defenses. Men and women who had sacrificed their sanity so that their comrades could resist alien interrogation. The price of human endurance had always been measured in suffering. But I am not some lesser species with crude mental techniques. Queen Vexithara continued, her crown pulsing brighter. I am the inheritor of knowledge spanning eons. I have personally broken the will of beings you cannot imagine. Gods of lesser species have begged for death rather than face my questions. Then ask your questions, Sarah said quietly. The queen paused, studying the human with something that might have been confusion. You misunderstand, soldier. I am not here to interrogate you about military secrets or strategic intelligence. Any competent commander would have given you false information to protect against capture. What I want from you is far more valuable. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the metal floor beneath her. What? I want to know what makes you human, the queen said, her alien features somehow managing to convey a predatory smile. I want to understand the force that allows your species to defy every law of conquest I have learned in 1,000 years of warfare. And I believe that force has a name. The queen moved even closer to the barrier, her massive form blocking out most of the light in the cell. When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. Tell me, human soldier, what is your name? Sarah felt the weight of the question settle over the cell like a physical presence. She had expected demands for military codes, fleet positions, or weapon specifications. But her name? The request seemed almost absurd. Yet the intensity in the alien queen's multifaceted eyes suggested otherwise. My name is Commander Sarah Chen, she said simply, watching for any reaction from her captor. The queen's head tilted again, that bird-like motion that seemed to be a gesture of consideration among her species. Chen, a designation from your homeworld, I assume. But that tells me nothing of importance. In my empire, names carry power. They define not just identity, but purpose, destiny, the very essence of what a being represents to the universe. The guards flanking Queen Vexithara remained motionless, but Sarah could sense their anticipation. Whatever was happening here went beyond standard interrogation protocol, even for aliens. The queen was pursuing some line of inquiry that even her own soldiers didn't fully understand. Among my people, the queen continued, beginning to pace before the energy barrier, names are earned through conquest, through the subjugation of lesser beings. I was not born Vexithara the Eternal. That title came after I personally led the siege of the crystalline worlds, after I broke the will of their living planets and added their biomass to our fleet. My name itself strikes fear into species across 3 galaxies. Sarah remained silent, but her mind raced. She was beginning to understand that this wasn't just interrogation, it was something closer to anthropological study. The queen wasn't just trying to extract information, she was trying to decode humanity itself. Yet your species confounds this natural order, the queen said, her patterns shifting from silver to deep red. When we captured the human colony on Kepler 442b, we expected the usual pattern. Surrender followed by collaboration, as lesser species always choose survival over dignity. Instead, we found something unprecedented. The queen stopped pacing and faced Sarah directly. The colonists fought for 17 days with farming equipment and improvised weapons. When our forces finally breached their defenses, they found carved into the central colony building a list of names. Not leaders, not heroes, not even soldiers. The names of children who had been evacuated. Grocery store clerks who had volunteered for combat duty. Janitors who had jury-rigged explosive devices from cleaning supplies. A memory flickered across Sarah's mind. She had been part of the relief force that arrived too late to save Kepler 442b, but she remembered the reports. The colony had held out far longer than anyone thought possible, buying time for refugee ships to reach safer systems. Those names, the queen continued, appeared to have significance beyond mere identification. Our xenological teams analyzed the engravings for months. They found no military codes, no hidden intelligence, no strategic value whatsoever. Yet the colonists died protecting those names as if they contained the secrets of the universe. Sarah finally understood what the queen was probing for. You don't understand memorial, she said quietly. Memorial. The queen's pattern shifted again, cycling through colors that had no human equivalent. The names on that wall weren't intelligence or codes. They were people who mattered. People worth remembering. When humans die fighting, We don't die for abstract concepts like victory or dominance. We die for each other, for the names that make us who we are. The Queen moved closer to the barrier, her massive form casting shadows that seemed to pulse with her crown's bioluminescence. Explain this concept of memorial to me. In my empire, the dead serve only as resources to be recycled into new forms of life. Their individual existence becomes irrelevant once their usefulness ends. Sarah thought of the wall of names she had seen in the colony ruins, carefully preserved even as the buildings around them crumbled. She thought of the memorial gardens on Earth, where billions of names were etched in stone and light. She thought of how humans carried their dead with them across the stars, not as ghosts or spirits, but as living memory that shaped every decision. When a human dies, Sarah said slowly, their name becomes part of who we are. Not just their family or friends, but all of us. Every time we face impossible odds, every time we have to choose between safety and doing what's right, we remember the names of those who made that choice before us. This makes no logical sense, the Queen said, but her voice carried a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. The dead cannot fight. They cannot contribute to victory or survival. What tactical advantage does this memorial provide? Sarah smiled again, and this time it reached her eyes. That's the point. You've been trying to understand humans through the lens of conquest and survival, but that's not what drives us. We don't fight because we're stronger or smarter or better equipped. We fight because somewhere along the way, someone with a name like ours decided that something was worth dying for. The Queen's guards shifted nervously as their ruler fell silent, processing this information. Sarah could see the alien intellect working, trying to fit this concept into frameworks that had successfully predicted and controlled the behavior of hundreds of species. During the Battle of Arcturus Station, Sarah continued, we lost 12,000 soldiers in a single day. The station was strategically worthless, a mining outpost with no military significance. But there were 40,000 civilian refugees aboard those ships trying to evacuate. The humans who died that day weren't fighting for territory or resources. They were fighting for names, for people who had families waiting for them in safer systems. The Queen's patterns had shifted to deep purple, a color Sarah had never seen from a Zephyrian before. And this emotional attachment to individual designations, this is what allows your species to defy superior force? It's not attachment, Sarah corrected. It's responsibility. Every human carries the names of everyone who came before them. When you kill one of us, you're not just ending a single life. You're threatening every name that person carried, every memory they preserved, every promise they made to the dead. Queen Vexithara stared at Sarah for a long moment, her alien features unreadable. When she finally spoke, her voice had changed. The certainty was gone, replaced by something that sounded almost like confusion. For 1,000 years, the Queen said slowly, I have based my understanding of warfare on a simple principle. Every species fights for survival, territory, or dominance. These are rational motivations that can be predicted, manipulated, and ultimately overcome through superior force. But you suggest that humans fight for memories? We fight for the continuation of everything that makes us human, Sarah said. And that includes remembering who we've lost along the way. The silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity. Finally, the Queen straightened to her full height, her crown pulsing with agitated bioluminescence. I will need time to consider this, she said. Guards, prepare the interrogation chamber. I believe I am beginning to understand why this species has proven so problematic. As the aliens filed out of the cell, Sarah heard the Queen mutter something in her native language. Her translation implant was damaged, but she caught enough to understand the meaning. Fighting for the dead. What manner of madness have we encountered? Hours passed in the detention cell before Sarah heard the familiar molecular shift of the door changing from solid to transparent. This time, only Queen Vexithara entered, her massive form somehow seeming less imposing than before. The absence of her guards was telling. This was no longer a formal interrogation. I have consulted with my war council, the Queen said without preamble. My most experienced generals, beings who have conquered star systems and broken entire civilizations. Each one assured me that what you described was impossible. Species do not fight effectively for abstract concepts like memory or honor. They fight for survival, for resources, for dominance. These are the only motivations that matter in warfare. Sarah remained seated on the floor, but she could see something had changed in the alien's demeanor. The absolute certainty that had defined Queen Vexithera during their first encounter was cracking. Yet, the Queen continued, beginning her measured pace again, I have spent the last several hours reviewing every engagement my forces have had with human forces. Every battle, every skirmish, every act of resistance, and I have found patterns that disturb me. The Queen activated a holographic display that materialized in the air between them. It showed tactical analyses, casualty reports, and strategic assessments spanning decades of warfare. The data swirled in three-dimensional formations that hurt Sarah's eyes to look at directly. Observation 1, the Queen said, highlighting specific battles in the display. Human forces consistently fight beyond the point where tactical surrender would be logical. The Battle of Wolf 359, your fleet was outnumbered 12-1, your ships were technologically inferior, and your supply lines were completely cut off. By every military doctrine I know, surrender should have occurred within hours. Instead, humans fought for 18 days. Sarah remembered Wolf 359. She had been a junior officer then, serving aboard a destroyer that had somehow survived the initial bombardment. The battle had become legendary in human space, not because they won, but because of what they had achieved in losing. During those 18 days, the Queen continued, my analysts noted something unprecedented. As human ships were destroyed, the remaining crews did not scatter or retreat as expected. Instead, they transmitted the names of their fallen comrades to the surviving vessels. Not tactical information or final orders. Names. Lists of dead humans that served no apparent military purpose. The holographic display zoomed in on communication, logs, showing endless streams of names being broadcast across the battle zone even as ships exploded around the transmitters. Sarah felt her throat tighten as she recognized some of the call signs. Friends who had died before she ever really got to know them. Observation 2, the Queen said, her patterns shifting to deep blue. Human resistance increases rather than decreases as casualties mount. This defies every model of warfare we have developed. Most species suffer degraded morale and fighting effectiveness as they lose personnel and equipment. Humans exhibit the opposite behavior. New data streams filled the air, showing psychological profiles and combat effectiveness ratings. The curves were indeed backwards from what would be expected, human forces becoming more determined and more dangerous as they lost people. My xenopsychologists initially attributed this to primitive stubbornness or inadequate survival instincts, the Queen said. But after reviewing your explanation of memorial, I instructed them to correlate human fighting effectiveness with name transmission frequencies. The results were illuminating. A new chart appeared, showing two overlapping curves. As the frequency of name transmissions increased during battles, so did human combat effectiveness. The correlation was undeniable. This suggests, the Queen said slowly, that the act of preserving and transmitting these individual designations actually enhances human military capability. It is as if your species derives strength from cataloging its losses. Sarah found her voice. We call it fighting for the fallen. Every name we remember is a promise we made to keep going. When Lieutenant Marcus Webb died protecting the evacuation ships at Wolf 359, he became more than just a memory. He became a reason for the rest of us to fight harder. The Queen stopped pacing and stared at Sarah with those multifaceted eyes. You speak of the dead as if they continue to influence battle outcomes. This is not metaphor, is it? You genuinely believe that preserving these names provides tactical advantage. It's not a belief, Sarah said, standing up for the first time since her capture. The energy shackles hummed in protest but didn't prevent the movement. It's observable reality. When humans know the names of who they're fighting for, they perform better. They take risks they wouldn't take for abstract goals. They endure hardships they couldn't endure for their own survival. Queen Vexithera's crown pulsed more rapidly, cycling through colors that seemed to indicate deep thought or confusion. I have ruled an empire for 6 centuries. I have studied warfare for twice that long. Yet you describe a form of military motivation that exists nowhere in my experience. Because your empire is built on dominance, Sarah said. When you conquer a species, you erase their individual identity and absorb them into your collective. You don't preserve names, you eliminate them. You can't understand human warfare because you've never encountered a species that fights to preserve rather than to conquer. The holographic display shifted again, showing star maps with the steady expansion of the Zephyrian Empire over the past millennium. World after world, system after system, all incorporated into the vast organism that was Queen Vexthara's domain. And then, at the edge of the display, was human space, a small cluster of stars that had resisted expansion for 50 years. You are saying, the Queen said carefully, that human military doctrine is based entirely on this concept of preserving individual identity across death, that your species has developed a form of warfare specifically designed to maintain what you call names, rather than to achieve victory. Sarah nodded. That's why you can't predict our tactics or break our morale using conventional methods. We're not fighting to win in the way you understand winning. We're fighting to remember. Every battle we lose, every ship you destroy, every colony you take, we make sure the names are preserved. And as long as the names survive, we keep fighting. The silence stretched between them for several minutes. Finally, the Queen spoke, her voice carrying a note of something that might have been respect. This explains certain anomalies in your species' behavior that my commanders have reported. Human prisoners who refuse to cooperate even under torture, not to protect military secrets, but to avoid dishonoring the memory of their dead. Colonies that fight to the last person, not because retreat is impossible, but because surrender would mean abandoning the graves of those who built them. Now you're beginning to understand, Sarah said. The Queen's patterns shifted to a color combination Sarah had never seen before. Silver streaks running through deep red, like lightning through blood. But this presents me with a strategic problem I have never encountered. If human resistance is not based on rational military considerations but on this memorial imperative, then conventional conquest becomes impossible. Sarah felt a cold smile cross her face. Welcome to the war you started but can't finish. Queen Vexthara stared at her prisoner for a long moment, then suddenly struck the energy barrier with one clawed hand. The barrier flared but held, and the Queen's frustrated shriek echoed through the cell like breaking crystal. You have given me much to consider, human, the Queen said finally. But perhaps it is time you learned something about the nature of your enemy. You speak of fighting for names and memories. But what happens when those memories themselves become weapons against you? The Queen turned toward the door, then paused. Tell me, Commander Sarah Chen, how many names do you carry with you? How many dead humans live in your memory? Sarah felt ice forming in her stomach. Thousands, maybe tens of thousands. And what would you do? The Queen asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. If those names could be taken from you? The question hung in the air like a physical threat. Sarah felt the implications of the Queen's words settling into her consciousness with the weight of a death sentence. To lose the name she carried would be worse than losing her own life. It would be the erasure of everyone she had ever fought beside. Everyone who had died trusting that their sacrifice would be remembered. You cannot take memories, Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction. She had seen enough alien technology to know that very few things were truly impossible for species that could manipulate matter at the quantum level. Queen Vexthara turned back to face her, and for the first time since Sarah's capture, the alien's expression seemed almost pleased. Can I not? My empire spans 3 galaxies, human. In that vast domain, I have encountered species with capabilities that would seem like magic to your primitive understanding. Memory weavers who can extract specific thoughts without leaving a trace. Neural architects who can rebuild consciousness according to any specification. The Queen activated her holographic display again, but this time it showed something that made Sarah's blood run cold. Medical diagrams of human neural structure appeared alongside what looked like surgical procedures, detailed enough that she could see individual nerve pathways being targeted and modified. For the past 10 years, the Queen continued, my scientists have been studying captured human soldiers. Not for military intelligence, as you assumed, but for something far more valuable, An understanding of how your species stores and processes these precious names you claim to fight for. Sarah tried to keep her expression neutral, but she could feel the horror building in her chest. The missing soldiers from the raids on the outer colonies. Volunteers, in a sense, the Queen said with what might have been satisfaction. They provided my researchers with invaluable data about human memory formation, retention, and retrieval. It took considerable time to understand the neural pathways involved in what you call memorial, but the investment has proven worthwhile. The holographic display zoomed in on specific brain regions, highlighting areas that pulsed with artificial color. Sarah recognized some of the anatomical structures from her basic military medical training, but the procedures being illustrated were far beyond human understanding. We discovered that human memory of the dead operates differently from ordinary recollection, the Queen explained, her patterns shifting to what Sarah was beginning to recognize as academic fascination. When your species remembers fallen comrades, specific neural clusters activate in patterns that suggest these memories are stored with unusual permanence and emotional weight. It is as if your brains have evolved specialized structures for preserving the identity of the dead. Sarah thought of how clearly she could recall the faces and voices of soldiers who had died decades ago, how their names seemed burned into her consciousness with perfect clarity, while other memories faded. The Queen's scientists had apparently identified the biological basis of human memorial. More interesting, the Queen continued, is that these memorial pathways appear to be interconnected across individual humans. When one human preserves the name of another, neural patterns suggest they are not merely storing information but accepting what can only be described as a form of psychological burden. You literally carry the dead with you at the neurological level. The implications were staggering. Sarah had always known that remembering the fallen was emotionally difficult, but she had never considered that it might involve actual biological processes that could be measured and manipulated. The fascinating aspect, Queen Vexithera said, her voice taking on the tone of a lecturer addressing students, is that these memorial pathways can be selectively targeted without affecting other cognitive functions. A human soldier could retain all their tactical knowledge, personal memories, and basic skills while losing every name they have ever carried for the dead. Sarah's knees nearly buckled. The thought of losing those names, of forgetting Marcus Webb and Elena Vasquez and thousands of others who had died trusting that they would be remembered, was more terrifying than any physical torture she could imagine. But there is more, the Queen continued, seemingly pleased by Sarah's reaction. My scientists discovered that these memorial pathways are not merely storage systems, but active networks that continue to influence behavior and decision-making. When a human remembers the dead, they are not simply recalling information but engaging with a psychological framework that shapes their responses to current situations. The holographic display showed neural activity patterns during simulated combat scenarios. Sarah could see how memories of fallen comrades triggered specific responses in the subjects being tested: increased aggression when defending positions, willingness to accept higher risk levels, enhanced coordination with fellow soldiers. In essence, the Queen said, we have identified the biological mechanism that makes your species so unpredictable in warfare. You do not fight as individuals, but as collective entities carrying the psychological patterns of all your dead. Each human soldier is, in effect, an army of memories. Sarah forced herself to speak through her growing horror. And you think you can weaponize this against us? I know I can, the Queen replied. The procedures have been tested and refined. Complete memorial erasure can be accomplished in a matter of hours, with no permanent damage to other cognitive functions. The subject retains their skills, knowledge, and personal identity, while losing all connection to the dead they once carried. The Queen moved closer to the energy barrier, her massive form blocking most of the light in the cell. Imagine, Commander Chen, if every human soldier captured in battle was returned to your forces with their memorial pathways severed. They would remember their training, their families, their personal experiences, but they would no longer carry the names of the fallen. They would fight only for themselves, only for their own survival. Sarah felt sick as she understood the full scope of the Queen's plan. You would turn us into what you are, individuals fighting only for personal gain. I would cure you of the Psychological disease that makes your species resist rational conquest, the Queen corrected. Without the burden of carrying your dead, humans would fight with the same predictable motivations as every other species in my empire. The memorial imperative that makes you so problematic would simply disappear. The holographic display changed, again, showing battle simulations with human forces exhibiting normal statistical behavior, retreating when outnumbered, surrendering when defeat became inevitable, operating according to logical self-preservation instincts. Of course, the Queen added, the process would need to be implemented on a significant scale to be truly effective. Individual soldiers could be returned as examples, but the real solution would require deployment on entire worlds at once. Atmospheric distribution of neural-targeted agents, perhaps, or integration into your food and water supplies. Sarah's mind reeled at the scope of what was being described. Not just the capture and conversion of individual soldiers, but the systematic erasure of human memorial capacity across entire populations. It would be genocide of a kind that had never been attempted before, the murder of memory itself. Why? Sarah asked finally. Why not just kill us? Why go to this effort? Queen Vexithara's patterns shifted to deep gold, a color Sarah was beginning to associate with the alien equivalent of a smile. Because death would make you martyrs would add more names to your memorial. But if I can remove your ability to remember the dead, then every death becomes meaningless. Your species would continue to exist, but the force that makes you human would be eliminated. The Queen turned toward the door again, then paused. I will give you time to consider the implications, Commander Chen. When next we speak, you will have the opportunity to experience this procedure firsthand. And then we will see how long your resistance lasts when you can no longer remember why you are fighting. As the door shifted back to solid metal, Sarah sank to the floor. For the first time since her capture, she felt true despair. The Queen had found a weapon against humanity that was more devastating than any physical force, the ability to murder the dead a second time by erasing them from the memory of the living. But as she sat in the darkness, one thought kept echoing in her mind. The Queen had made one crucial mistake. She assumed that human memorial was entirely biological, entirely contained within individual neural pathways. Sarah began to smile as she realized what the alien had overlooked. Sarah had been alone in the cell for what felt like days when the door materialized again. This time, Queen Vexithara was accompanied by creatures Sarah had never seen before. Tall, ethereal beings with translucent skin and surgical instruments that seemed to bend reality around their edges. The Queen's memorial specialists, undoubtedly. The time for conversation has ended, Commander Chen, the Queen announced. You will now experience firsthand the liberation from the burden of carrying your dead. But Sarah was ready. During her time alone, she had reached a conclusion that filled her with grim satisfaction. Before you begin, she said, rising to her feet, I have something to tell you about human memorial that your scientists missed. Queen Vexithara's patterns shifted to irritated red. Nothing you say will prevent this procedure. My specialists have perfected the technique through extensive testing on your fellow humans. I'm sure they have, Sarah replied calmly. But they studied individual soldiers in isolation. They never examined how human memorial actually works at the species level. Despite herself, the Queen seemed intrigued. With a gesture, she halted the approaching specialists. Explain quickly. Your delaying tactics will not succeed for long. Sarah took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. You understand human memorial as a biological storage system contained within individual brains. But that's only part of the mechanism. The real power of human memorial isn't in how we store names. It's in how we share them. The Queen's head tilted in that bird-like gesture of confusion. Share them? Every name I carry belongs not just to me, but to every other human who knew that person, Sarah explained. When Lieutenant Marcus Webb died at Wolf 359, his name didn't just become part of my memory. It became part of the memorial carried by hundreds of other soldiers who served with him, thousands of civilians who heard his story, millions of humans who learned about his sacrifice through historical records. Sarah could see she had the Queen's attention now. The alien's patterns were cycling through colors that suggested deep thought and growing unease. Your scientists could erase my memory of Marcus Webb, Sarah continued. but they cannot erase him from the collective memory of humanity. And the moment I encounter another human who remembers him, through a story, a historical record, even graffiti on a wall, his name returns to my consciousness. Not as new information, but as recovered memorial. The Queen's specialists exchanged what looked like concerned glances, their translucent features shifting with uncertainty. Queen Vexthera herself had gone very still, her patterns locked into a deep purple that Sarah was beginning to associate with serious consideration. Furthermore, Sarah pressed on, human memorial doesn't just preserve names, it preserves the emotional and psychological weight associated with those names. Even if you could somehow erase every trace of Marcus Webb from my individual memory, the memorial framework he helped create would remain. The part of me that fights harder because of his sacrifice, the tactical instincts shaped by his example, the moral imperatives reinforced by his death, all of that would persist even without conscious recollection. Sarah moved closer to the energy barrier, meeting the Queen's alien gaze directly. But here's what your scientist really failed to understand. Human memorial isn't just about preserving the dead. It's about creating continuity across generations. Every human child grows up hearing the names of those who came before them. Every soldier enters service already carrying the memorial burden of countless predecessors. You cannot erase this with individual procedures because it exists at the cultural level, not just the biological level. The Queen finally spoke, her voice carrying a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. You suggest that this memorial system has redundancy across your entire species. I'm saying that human memorial is distributed, Sarah clarified. It exists simultaneously in individual minds, in historical records, in cultural traditions, in art and literature and music. You would have to erase not just the memories of living humans, but every trace of human civilization itself, to truly eliminate the names we carry. Queen Vexithara turned to her specialists, speaking in rapid bursts of her native language. Sarah's damaged translation implant could only catch fragments, but the tone suggested growing alarm. The specialists responded with what sounded like defensive explanations, but their body language suggested they were realizing the scope of what they had missed. Even if that were true, the Queen said, turning back to Sarah, it would merely require a more comprehensive approach. My empire has eliminated entire civilizations before. We could sterilize every human world, destroy every record, erase every trace of your species' existence. Sarah smiled again, and this time it carried no warmth whatsoever. Could you? Because I haven't told you the most important part yet. The Queen's pattern shifted to what Sarah recognized as dangerous attention. Speak. Human memorial doesn't just flow backward in time, Sarah said. It flows forward. Every name I carry, every sacrifice I remember, creates expectations for my own future actions. When I die, and I will die whether you kill me today or in 50 years, my name will join the memorial carried by other humans, but the weight of that name will depend on what I accomplish before I die. Sarah paused, letting the implications settle before continuing. This means that every human you capture, every soldier you torture, every civilian you threaten, has the potential to become part of our memorial system. Not just as victims, but as examples of human endurance under impossible circumstances. The Queen's crown had begun pulsing rapidly, cycling through colors that suggested agitation or confusion. You claim that threatening humans makes them more dangerous? I'm saying that the more extreme the circumstances humans face, the more powerful the memorial they create becomes, Sarah explained. A soldier who dies fighting overwhelming odds becomes more than just a memory, they become a standard that future humans will feel compelled to meet or exceed. Sarah gestured toward the alien specialists with their reality-bending instruments. Right now, as we speak, you are creating the circumstances for a new kind of human memorial. If you erase my memories and return me to human space, I won't just be Sarah Chen, the soldier who got captured. I'll be Sarah Chen, the soldier who survived alien mind control technology. Every human who meets me will carry that name forward with enhanced significance. The Queen had gone completely still, her patterns locked into a shade of deep blue that seemed to indicate shock or realization. You suggest that resistance to my memorial erasure procedures would itself become part of your species' memorial system. I'm not suggesting it, Sarah said firmly. I'm guaranteeing it. Human memorial adapts to new threats by incorporating them into our collective memory. If you develop the ability to erase individual memories, humans will develop cultural practices to counteract that ability. We'll create external memorial systems, physical monuments, digital records, genetic encoding of names into DNA itself, if necessary. The specialists were now speaking among themselves in urgent tones. Sarah couldn't understand their words, but their body language suggested they were reconsidering the viability of their entire approach. But the most important factor, Sarah continued, is something your scientists couldn't have discovered through individual testing. Human memorial isn't just about preserving the past. It's about inspiring the future. Every name we carry creates an obligation to be worthy of that memory. The more names you force us to carry through your actions, the more determined we become. Queen Vexthara's patterns had shifted to something Sarah had never seen before, a chaotic swirl of colors that seemed to suggest complete cognitive disruption. You are saying that my attempts to eliminate human memorial would actually strengthen it. I'm saying that you fundamentally misunderstood what you were fighting, Sarah replied. You thought you were fighting individual humans who happened to remember their dead, but you're actually fighting the accumulated memorial weight of every human who has ever lived. And that weight increases every time you take an action that would create new names for us to remember. The silence that followed stretched for several minutes. Finally, Queen Vexithara spoke in a voice that carried none of her earlier certainty. Guards, she said quietly, escort these specialists back to their laboratories. Tell them to suspend all memorial research until further notice. As the aliens filed out, the Queen remained behind, staring at Sarah with an expression that might have been something like fear. Commander Chen, she said finally, I believe I am beginning to understand why your species has proven so problematic for my empire. The hours that followed were unlike any Sarah had experienced since her capture. Queen Vexthara didn't leave the cell. Instead, she settled into what appeared to be a meditative posture near the far wall, her crown pulsing in slow, rhythmic patterns that suggested deep thought. Occasionally, the alien would speak, posing questions that seemed to probe the fundamental nature of human civilization. Tell me about your historical records, the Queen said, after a particularly long silence. How do humans preserve the names of those who died before living memory? Sarah found herself in the bizarre position of conducting an anthropology seminar with her captor. We have monuments, databases, literature, oral traditions. Some families keep genealogical records going back thousands of years. We've built memorial walls on every human world with space to add new names as needed. And children learn these names? Some of them. The important ones. Every human child grows up knowing about the soldiers who died in the First Colonial War, the scientists who sacrificed themselves to stop the Titan Station reactor breach, the civilians who held the line during the Proxima Centauri evacuation. Sarah paused, thinking, we don't memorize every name, but we carry the weight of knowing that every name represents someone who mattered. Queen Vexthara's patterns shifted to deep gold. In my empire, historical records serve only to chronicle victories and territorial acquisitions. The individual identities of those who achieved these victories are irrelevant once they have served their purpose. That's why you don't understand us, Sarah said. For humans, individual identity is never irrelevant. Even our victories are meaningless unless we remember who paid for them. The Queen rose and began pacing again, but her movements seemed less predatory than before. I have been considering the implications of what you have told me. If human memorial operates as you describe, as a distributed, self-reinforcing system that grows stronger under pressure, then conventional conquest becomes not merely difficult but counterproductive. Sarah nodded. Every atrocity you commit creates new martyrs. Every victory you achieve gives us new reasons to resist. You've been trying to break human will through force, but force is what creates the memorial that drives human resistance. This presents me with a strategic paradox I have never encountered, the Queen admitted. If I escalate military action against human worlds, I strengthen the very force that makes humans resistant to conquest. But if I reduce pressure, I allow your species time to consolidate and expand. For the first time, Sarah heard something like uncertainty in the alien ruler's voice. Queen Vexithara had spent centuries perfecting the art of conquest, only to encounter a species that seemed to become stronger through defeat. There is another factor you have not considered, Sarah said carefully. The war between your empire and humanity has been going on for 50 years. By now, your own name has become part of human memorial. The Queen stopped pacing abruptly. Explain. Queen Vexthera the Eternal, Sarah said, watching the alien's reaction. The destroyer of worlds. The creature who burned the colonies of New Geneva and Kepler 442b. Your name is spoken in every human military academy, carved into monument walls throughout human space. You've become part of our memorial system. The alien's patterns flickered rapidly through colors that suggested agitation. I am the enemy. Human memorial systems would preserve enemy identities. Human memorial preserves the names of everyone who shaped our history, Sarah explained. Heroes and villains both. Children throughout human space grow up learning your name alongside the names of our greatest leaders. You represent the force that we define ourselves in opposition to. Sarah could see the implications hitting the Queen like physical blows. Which means, the alien said slowly, that even if I succeeded in conquering humanity entirely, my own name would persist in whatever memorial system survived. And that would create a problem for your empire that would last forever, Sarah agreed. Because as long as humans remembered your name, they would remember that resistance was possible. Even under total domination, the memorial of Queen Vexithara would serve as inspiration for future rebellion. The Queen's crown had begun pulsing erratically, cycling through colors so rapidly that Sarah could barely track them. I have created a situation where my very success becomes the foundation for future failure. Now you're beginning to understand the real nature of the war you started, Sarah said. You're not just fighting humans, you're fighting the idea of what humans represent. And ideas are much harder to kill than people. Queen Vexithara stared at Sarah for a long moment, then suddenly struck the energy barrier with both clawed hands. The impact sent feedback through the containment system, causing sparks to cascade from the ceiling. When the Queen spoke, her voice carried a note of something that might have been despair. For 6 centuries, I have ruled through the simple principle that superior force inevitably triumphs over inferior force. Every species I have encountered has eventually submitted when faced with overwhelming power. But your species has weaponized its own defeat, turned suffering into strength, made martyrdom into military doctrine. The Queen moved to the cell's far wall and seemed to lean against it, her massive form suddenly looking less imposing. You have forced me to confront the possibility that there are forms of warfare I do not understand. Strategies that exist beyond the realm of tactics and technology. Sarah felt an unexpected moment of something like sympathy for her captor. Queen Vexthara had built an empire on assumptions that had never failed before, only to encounter a species that operated according to completely different rules. It's not that humans are better at warfare, Sarah said quietly. We're just fighting for different reasons than anyone you've met before. Most species fight for survival or dominance. Humans fight for continuity, to ensure that the sacrifices of the past weren't meaningless and that future generations will remember what we stood for. The Queen's patterns had settled into a deep purple that Sarah associated with profound thought. This continuity, this preservation of meaning across generations, this is what you believe makes your species special? Sarah considered the question carefully. I think it's what makes us human. Not special, necessarily, but definitely different. We're willing to accept defeat if it serves the larger goal of ensuring that human values survive. Human values, the Queen repeated. And what are those values precisely? That every individual life has meaning. That death doesn't erase the importance of what someone accomplished while they lived. That future generations have an obligation to remember and learn from the past. Sarah paused, then added, that freedom and dignity are worth dying for, even when dying seems pointless. Queen Vexithara was silent for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a tone Sarah had never heard. From the alien before, something that sounded almost like regret. I have spent 1,000 years building an empire based on the assumption that individual significance was an illusion, that only collective achievement mattered. My species evolved from hive-mind organisms that valued the success of the whole over the survival of any component. We brought that philosophy to the stars and used it to justify the conquest of countless worlds. The Queen turned to face Sarah directly. But you have presented me with evidence that individual significance can become a source of collective strength, rather than collective weakness. That preservation of personal identity across death can serve as a foundation for civilization, rather than an obstacle to it. Sarah felt a chill as she realized where this conversation was heading. What are you going to do? Queen Vexthara's pattern shifted to the chaotic swirl that indicated severe cognitive disruption. I am going to do something I have never done in 6 centuries of rule. I am going to reconsider everything I believe about the nature of power, conquest, and civilization itself. The Queen moved toward the door, then paused. But first, Commander Sarah Chen, I am going to ask you a question that may determine the future of both our species. Sarah braced herself. If I were to offer humanity a choice between continued warfare and peaceful coexistence, which do you believe your species would choose? Sarah felt the weight of the question settle over her like a physical presence. The fate of 2 civilizations might depend on her answer, and she knew that Queen Vexithara would analyze every word for deeper meaning. That depends entirely on the terms, Sarah said finally. Humans have always been willing to choose peace when it doesn't require surrendering the values that make us human. And what would those terms need to include? Sarah thought carefully. This was no longer an interrogation or academic discussion. It was a negotiation that could end a 50-year war or ensure its continuation for generations. Recognition that human worlds belong to humanity, she began. No forced integration into your empire. No demands for cultural assimilation. No interference with our memorial systems or historical preservation. Queen Vexithara's patterns shifted to interested gold. You would demand complete autonomy. We would demand the right to remain human, Sarah corrected. Trade, cultural exchange, even military cooperation against common threats, all of that would be possible. But we won't become another component in your empire, and we won't allow you to erase what makes us who we are. The Queen was silent for several minutes. Her crown pulsing in the slow rhythm that Sarah had learned indicated deep thought. When she spoke, her words carried implications that made Sarah's breath catch. What if I told you that your species has already accomplished something no other conquered people ever achieved? What if I told you that human memorial has begun to affect my own empire in ways I never anticipated? I'd ask you to explain, Sarah said, though she suspected she already knew where this was heading. My soldiers have been exposed to human prisoners for 50 years, the Queen said. They have heard your stories of memorial, witnessed your refusal to abandon the dead, observed the way humans fight with the weight of the past upon their shoulders. And some of them have begun to question why the Zephyrian Empire preserves no individual names, honors no personal sacrifice, remembers no fallen except as recycled resources. Sarah felt a surge of hope mixed with terror. If human memorial was spreading to alien soldiers, it could change the entire dynamic of the war, or provoke Queen Vexithara to escalate to total extermination. There have been incidents, the Queen continued. Soldiers refusing to destroy human monuments, officers attempting to preserve the names of defeated enemies, entire units requesting reassignment rather than participate in operations that would erase human memorial sites. The alien moved closer to the energy barrier, her massive form blocking most of the light. For the first time in my empire's history, I faced the possibility of ideological resistance from within my own forces. Not rebellion based on desire for power or territory, but principled opposition based on moral considerations that did not exist in Zephyrian culture until we encountered humanity. Sarah realized she was witnessing something unprecedented, a galactic empire, experiencing an identity crisis caused by contact with human values. Your soldiers are developing individual conscience. More than that, the Queen said, her patterns shifting to the chaotic swirl that indicated severe distress. They are developing the concept of individual significance that underlies human memorial. They have begun to see fallen comrades as individuals worth remembering, rather than as components that can be efficiently replaced. The implications were staggering. Human memorial wasn't just preserving human resistance, it was actively converting alien soldiers to a fundamentally different way of viewing existence. How widespread is this? Sarah asked. Unknown, the Queen admitted, but significant enough that my military commanders have begun requesting the deployment of pure Zephyrian units with no exposure to human prisoners or captured territory. They fear further ideological contamination. Sarah couldn't suppress a smile. You're afraid that prolonged contact with humans will turn your empire into something like us. I am afraid, Queen Vexithara said, her voice carrying a note of vulnerability that Sarah had never heard from the alien, that continued warfare will destroy both our civilizations. not through military defeat but through fundamental transformation into something neither of us would recognize. The Queen activated her holographic display again, but this time it showed something entirely different. Star charts appeared, but not of conquered territories or battle zones. These showed potential boundaries, negotiated zones, areas where two different forms of civilization might coexist without destroying each other. I have spent the past several days developing proposals for what your species might call a peace treaty, the Queen said. Terms that would end hostilities while preserving the essential characteristics of both civilizations. Sarah studied the displays, hardly daring to believe what she was seeing. The proposed boundaries gave humanity control over all currently occupied worlds plus room for expansion. Trade routes were mapped out between species territories. Even provision was made for joint memorial sites where both species could honor their war dead. Why? Sarah asked. Why would you give up conquest after 1,000 years of empire building? Queen Vexithara's pattern settled into deep blue, the color Sarah associated with profound sadness or regret. Because I have come to understand that true conquest of humanity is impossible. I can destroy your species, but I cannot make you submit without fundamentally changing what submission means. And in the process of trying to understand you well enough to defeat you, I have begun to doubt whether conquest itself is a worthy goal. The alien gestured toward the holographic displays. These memorial systems you described, this preservation of individual significance across death, they serve functions in your civilization that I never considered. They provide continuity, meaning, inspiration for future generations. They create a form of immortality that my empire's recycling systems cannot match. Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes as she realized the full scope of what was being offered. You're saying that exposure to human memorial has changed your entire philosophical framework. I am saying, the Queen replied, that I can no longer be certain that Zephyrian civilization represents the optimal form of organized existence. Your species has demonstrated that individual significance and collective strength are not mutually exclusive. That preservation of the past can enhance rather than hinder progress toward the future. The holographic display shifted again, showing detailed treaty provisions that addressed everything from territorial boundaries to cultural exchange protocols. Sarah recognized concepts from human diplomatic tradition, mutual defense agreements, trade regulations, even provisions for peaceful dispute resolution. If I present these terms to the human government, Sarah said carefully, they'll want to know what guarantees exist that you won't change your mind and resume conquest. Queen Vexithara was silent for a long moment, then spoke in a voice that carried the weight of absolute decision. Because I intend to implement human memorial systems within the Zephyrian Empire itself. Sarah's breath caught. You want to remember your own dead as individuals? I want to discover whether an empire that preserves individual significance might prove more enduring than one that recycles its components, the Queen explained. Your species has shown me that memory can be a source of strength rather than weakness. I wish to learn whether this principle can be adapted to benefit my own people. The alien moved to the cell controls and began deactivating the energy shackles around Sarah's wrists. But such a fundamental transformation of my civilization will require guidance from those who understand memorial systems. It will require cooperation rather than conquest. Sarah felt the shackles fall away for the first time since her capture. You're offering alliance instead of surrender. I am offering mutual evolution, Queen Vexithara corrected. Two species learning from each other rather than attempting to destroy each other. Humanity can teach my empire about individual significance and memorial preservation. In return, we can share technologies and knowledge that will benefit both civilizations. The energy barrier deactivated, leaving nothing between Sarah and the most powerful being in 3 galaxies except empty air and mutual understanding. Commander Sarah Chen, Queen Vexithara said, extending one clawed hand in what was clearly meant as a gesture of greeting rather than threat. I hereby offer you safe passage back to human territory as the first ambassador between our species. Will you carry my proposal for peace to your leaders? Sarah stepped forward and, after a moment's hesitation, grasped the alien hand. It was surprisingly warm, and she could feel the slight vibration of the Queen's exotic biology. I'll carry your message, Sarah said, but I want you to understand something about human memorial that might matter for these negotiations. Speak. When I return to human space and tell the story of these conversations, your name will be preserved in human memorial not as Queen Vexithara the Conqueror, But as Queen Vexithara the Peacemaker, the alien ruler who chose wisdom over warfare, that's the name that will be passed down to future generations. For the first time since Sarah had met her, Queen Vexithara seemed genuinely speechless. Her patterns cycled through colors that had no human equivimo.